Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to finish the series on the London system, and in this final video we are going to look at Dutch setups for black. The Dutch is a very tricky and aggressive opening for black, as you know if you are a d4 player, and Dutch players usually look for very aggressive positions in which they could be the ones attacking, in which they would be the ones who accept a positional or a strategic disadvantage in order to get an aggressive position. When white plays the London system, the positions are not like that, and I think that's very frustrating for the Dutch player, because the London system is too solid and the positions are quite different to normal Queen's Gambit d4 c4 setups, that black doesn't really achieve the same positions he would achieve normally. So we are going to be looking at positions with the pawn on f5, which characterize the Dutch defense. Now this could be achieved from two different move orders. Usually a more common move order is pawn to e6 on move 1 for black. Why? Because that avoids the Trumpovsky, and it also gives black some more flexibility. It doesn't avoid the London system though. But basically we are going to be looking at positions with pawn to f5 and two different setups for black. One of them is the so-called Leningrad Dutch setup with pawn to g6, and the other one is the classical Dutch setup with pawn to e6. Now let's just have a look at normal Dutch defenses. So d4, d5. Normally white is going to play g3, that's the main move. And now let's say knight to f6, bishop to g2, and here black could choose between two different setups. Pawn to e6 is the classical Dutch, pawn to g6 is the Leningrad Dutch. They're different, and I'm not going to get into the Dutch defense theory. That will actually start tomorrow. But yeah, the setups, it's important to know them if you play the London system, even if you don't play the main lines. Okay, so after d4 f5, there are a ton of options white could choose. I'll just mention them briefly. The two options that are going to interest us are 2 bishop f4 and 2 knight f3, which get you into the London system. Now, as you said, you could play g3, which leads to mainline Dutch defenses. You could play c4, which also leads to very mainline positions. Knight to c3 is the Raphael Dutch. That's slightly strange. Bishop to g5 is the Hopton attack. You can of course play the very aggressive Staunton Gambit, which is, by the way, another reason why most people are going to play one e6, because that avoids the Staunton Gambit. But the two moves that we are going to be looking at are knight f3 and bishop f4. Now, there is a benefit to playing 2 bishop f4. There are two very concrete reasons. The first reason I'm going to show you now, and the second one we are going to look at when we look at g6 positions. The first reason is to play 2 bishop to f4 is if black doesn't even play the Dutch, if he plays 2 d5, then you have a symmetrical London system, which you can see in the second video in the series, where there are important variations in which one tempo is going to be very crucial. More precisely, it's going to be crucial to have the option to meet the move queen b6 with a good defense for white, let's say, in which case the knight on f3 won't be as useful, or it will be useless. Other moves are going to be more useful, like c3 and knight to d2. So that's why it's important to play bishop to f4, because if black doesn't play the Dutch, if he plays the move queen to d5, pawn to d5, then it's better to have this setup with 2 bishop to f4. The second reason, as I said, we are going to look at in a second. But 2 knight to f3 is also quite okay, and the positions are not that different. Also after e6, if you play knight f3 and they play d5, well, you don't even have to play the London system. But let's say d4, f5, knight to f3. Now the positions are not that different. Most often they are going to transpose, but there is a very important variation, which I'm going to show you now, which is the main reason why I would recommend bishop to f4. So if you play the bishop f4 line and your opponent continues knight f6, which is the main move, you continue with e3, you want to create the London system triangle of pawns. There is a mistake black could play with, which doesn't lose the game, doesn't lose material, but it leads to very sharp positions in which white is much better. And that's if black tries to go for a Leningrad Dutch setup immediately with pawn to g6. Now, this is a very important variation you need to learn how to try and punish. You play the move h4. Whenever your opponent plays g6, that creates a target. And the reason why not playing knight f3 helps us with this setup, and the reason why if you play knight f3 instead of bishop f4 this setup isn't possible, is because the h5 square is controlled too much. In this position, if black, for example, plays knight h5, you can simply continue with bishop to e2. You don't mind black taking this bishop on f4. That's always good in the Dutch, because you will have pressure along the semi-open e file, and you will have this lever to open up the black position, and here white is much better. You could even continue with g3, bishop f3, knight to e2 if the pawns are attacked. If they are not, you could just play bishop f3, knight to e2. So against the early g6, it's much better to have this setup with bishop f4, e3 than to have a setup with knight f3, bishop f4, because knight f3 is blocking bishop e2. So if they play g6, you just play h4, and I'll show you the idea behind this. So black really should stop the move h5 with the move h6. If he doesn't, if he plays something normal like d6, then h5, and let's say knight takes, rook takes, pawn takes, queen takes, this is just game over, and black could resign. So normally after h4, players who know what they're doing, but for some reason they have decided to allow this variation, they're going to play h6. And now this is a very important point. If you start with this bishop f4 setup, a lot of Dutch players are going to be playing the move g6. And here's an important point. Against this, against h4, h6, you want to play the move knight c3. There's a very specific reason for that. The reason is you have committed yourself to a kingside attack. You want to be castling queenside, in which case this knight is very useful, controls the center, defends a2, king b1 will not be necessary, and you basically don't want to be breaking the center when your king is on the queen side. So for example, d6, which is the main move for white, and now a pattern which has been played about 10 times in Grandmaster games, and that's queen f3, queen g3. Queen f3, bishop to g7, queen g3, this is all theory. King f7 and castles queenside. And this is the way to punish the early g6. Now, as I said, white is not winning. He did not win any material. The engines think white is slightly better, but in practical play, this is very hard for black to play. Look at black's development. He's only playing with 2 pieces. His king is on f7, and white has a huge attack. Okay, so that's why I think you should play bishop f4 instead of knight to f3. But nevertheless, if they don't commit to g6, then it will transpose. Let's look at the positions with knight f3 just so that I could illustrate that it's quite similar. So knight to f6, and you play bishop f4 now. And there are 2 setups, as we said. e6 or g6. g6, the Leningrad Dutch setup, e6, the classical Dutch setup. Now, e6 is easier to play against, and if you keep things simple against e6, you will have very easy attacking games. And I like this for white. I like the London system against the Dutch for white, because you sort of turn the tables and you start attacking black. So against e6, I would recommend going for a quick kingside attack. So e3, bishop to e7, this is what you play in the classical Dutch. Now h3, and h3 is not designed to save the bishop. This is a very important point. Don't try to save your bishop. If you don't want to go for a kingside attack, don't play h3. You play h3 to prepare g4. I'll show you why. For example, if you don't play h3 and you play bishop e2 or bishop d3, and they play knight h5, you can just castle. And if they take, in the classical Dutch, there's a pawn on e6, and that pawn is a huge target. Sometimes if they play d6 or if they play d5, this pawn is going to drop. So it's not that easy to develop your bishop. That means that the bishop is going to have to go to b7, which is not a bad square. But if it goes to b7 and if the d pawn hadn't moved, that means that the black pawn is never going to be on d5. That means that you can continue with c4 and d5 and undermine black's center. So you are never afraid. You are never afraid of knight h5 against the classical Dutch. Okay, so you don't have to play h3 to save your bishop. You play h3 to blast open the black position. Okay, so black castles, everything normal. Inexperienced players are going to think that h3 is designed to stop knight h5, but it's not. Okay, bishop d3. And here's a point I would like to talk about. Against g6 setups, don't play bishop d3 because it's going to be biting on granite on this pawn chain. So we'll have a pawn chain with f5, g6, h7, and most often it's going to look like this. Black is going to play e6 and g6 against the London system. So don't play bishop d3. Against g6 setups, if you don't go for the early h4, you want your bishop either on e2 or on c4. And in my opinion, c4 is better because if black plays g6 without e6, then this bishop is going to be strong. Okay, but bishop d3 against these setups, and specifically for a kingside attack, is the best move. Why? Because you've prepared the move g4 and you want to blast open the position. One way for black to develop his pieces, which I think is best, is b6, bishop b7. Since in the classical Dutch your pawns are on light squares, okay, you may play d6, you want your bishop on this very long, very beautiful diagonal. And since white is playing the London system, his pawns are on dark squares, which means that this diagonal is basically free for black to occupy it. So b6, white continues, knight bd7. Bishop b7 and c3. You don't have to play c3, but if you want to play a proper London system, you're going to play it eventually. Usually it's better to play it after black plays c5, but I wanted to illustrate the normal attacking setup I would recommend. So black, of course, same as white, can use the weakness on these corresponding squares e4 and e5. So he should jump into e4. You never want to take that with white because he will recapture with the pawn. Even if you don't lose a piece, let's say you take with the bishop, your f3 knight has to move and it's going to be awkward. So when they play knight e4, never take it. Just don't take it. Instead, you completely ignore what black is doing and you just go for checkmate. And I think that's going to be very hard for Dutch players to accept. So what white should do against the Dutch when he's playing the London system, he should just go for mate. Okay, so what do? You play the move rook g1. And black should seek counterplay in the center and on the queen side, because doing anything on the king side would weaken his position. So black should continue with c5. Now we see how useful c3 was. The center is supported. And now g4. And here there was one game played from this position which I would advise you to analyze. It's Igor Kenkin versus Peter Meister, played in 2010. You can find it on ChessBase and also on chessgames.com. So that you can see how the game ended. I'll just show you a few lines, and they actually played engine moves, so they were both well prepared. They were, I think, strong international masters. So c takes d4, and if black does something about the king side, or if black wastes time, then white is just too quick. What white wants to do is checkmate, so white should be ignoring what black is doing as well. So g takes f5, and knight c5. This is a very good move, attacking this strong bishop. The bishop has to move. You move it to b1 so that you would have queen c2, and that's one of the main ideas in this attack. dc3, bc3. And now ef5. In the game, the sacrifice was the exchange was sacrificed with rook takes f5. I think ef5 is more sound. And now white continues with knight d4, which is another reason why you don't really want to take with the pawn, which is why I think the strong IM took with the rook, because now you don't have the move e5, attacking rook and bishop, knight and bishop. And I think this position is very dominant for white. Now, that's a setup you should go for. You're never going to get this exact same thing. Well, if you're lucky, you might. But it's really not hard to achieve it. So let's look at what happens. If they play the classical setup, you go for e3, bishop e7, you go for h3. Again, inexperienced players are going to think it's to save your bishop. It's not. So castles, bishop to d3, b6, knight bd2, bishop b7, c3, knight e4, fine. If they don't play knight e4, they can play knight c6, d6, c5. It's going to be very similar to this anyway. But you do your own thing. You play bishop f4, knight f3, e3, bishop d3, knight d2, c3, h3, rook g1, g4, gf5. And that's it. That's your set. Okay, and against the Leningrad setup with g6, if you've played knight f3 or if black has delayed playing the move g6, this is basically going to happen and you're not going to go for the quick h4 attack. So I'll just show you what you do against this setup. And now, unlike the classical Dutch, these Leningrad Dutch positions are going to be more positional because black is going to have very good central control with e6 and g6. I've heard this setup being called the Christmas tree Dutch by Ginger Gem, said that in one of his videos. I don't know what the actual name is, but I call everything with g6 the Leningrad Dutch. So okay, bishop to g7, and as I said, when they play g6, you don't want your bishop on d3, so inexperienced London system players are always going to play the same setup. There are some nuances. If you don't know them, try to think. If he has 3 pawns on the diagonal, just don't put your bishop there. Okay, you can also play bishop e2, but bishop e2 is more useful when you go for h4, h5. So if you plan to go for a hack attack on the king side, then bishop e2. If you want to play a slower game, then bishop c4. And the reason why they should play e6 is because of bishop c4. If you'd played the move bishop e2, they could have just castled. And in this position, I think castling is a slight mistake because h4. The problem is after h5, you now have the move knight e5 and you're threatening to take the knight. Again, if they take, that's really no issue. We'll just continue with h5. So against bishop e2, I think castling is imprecise. d6 should be played just to delay this whole operation for a while. Something like knight b to d2, and castles now should probably be okay. Just try to get in some more moves before castling as black. Okay, so bishop c4 I think is best. And after bishop c4, e6, c3, you try to complete your pawn triangle. I should say that knight to c3 is objectively a better move according to the engines, but that's not the London system anymore, so play the pawn triangle. It's not much worse, it's almost the same, and it's really hard for humans to understand why knight c3 is better. What I can tell you is that if you play c3, c5 is not going to be as effective, so just keep your center solid. Okay, black castles. You played knight b to d2, they play b6 as they did in the previous setup. You play h3. Again, this move is designed for a kingside attack, but more importantly in this position, you want to play the move bishop to h2, because in some positions you are going to want to go for e4. And sometimes after e4, f takes e4, this bishop is going to be hanging. So in some positions, h3 is played for bishop h2. You can also play bishop g3, that's true, but most people don't really want to allow f takes or h takes if you don't have a rook on the h file. So h3, bishop h2, slightly more common. As I said, in some positions where you don't have anything you can do easily, you want to play e4 in the London system, so the bishop is not attacked if you put it on h2. So bishop b7, castles is one way to play. Again, you could play g4, slightly unsound, but you can go for that. I would advise you to play this against weaker or much stronger players because it's hard to play against. Again, look at the previous variation, it's very similar to this. But castles is better. Knight c6, knight e5. And here's what you do against the Leningrad setups. You use the e5 square, which you use in most London system variations. You use it to start an attack from there. If the knight is taken, then of course white should stand slightly better because of this pawn, and you can continue with either knight e4, bishop e4, a4, trying to block the queen side, or you can continue with knight f3 and try to create an attack on the king side. Okay, in this position that would be bad because of g5, but a bit later on. So here white should be slightly better. So after knight e5, I don't think black should be taking that. Black should probably continue with d6, or if the pawn is protected, that is, and try to finish his development and play around the knight. Alternatively, if you don't start an attack, you could go for e4, as I said, and this I think is a slightly better plan because it's positional. So now black should try expanding on the queen side. That's one of the best plans. And now in order to support e4, if you switch to this plan, getting your bishop to d3 could be useful. So what I said earlier about the bishop not being good on d3, that's not true if you go for e4. But it's going for e4 you will do in very specific situations, and you have to prepare it with h3, bishop h2, so it's very committal. It's much easier to provoke the move e6 and to try to attack with your bishop on c4. So knight e7, opening the bishop up, defending e4, and now bishop to h2 prepares the move e4. Now if black doesn't know what he is doing, so I don't know, plays rook c8, then e4 should be overwhelmingly good for white. So players with black, when they see e4 is coming, they should block it with knight e4. And now the position gets complicated. And as I said, these Leningrad setups could be much more positional, much more strategic in nature, and the classical setups could just be over in 20 moves. Okay, I hope you liked the video. I hope you like the series. We are continuing with theory tomorrow. Please let me know what you think. If you have any feedback, I would appreciate it. And stay tuned for more chess. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.